Good afternoon, and thank you for tuning in. I'm joined on the line by Gideon Jubeb, who is in Cape Town, and by Roman Kabanek, who is also in Cape Town. They will both be joining us by audio links only. Gentlemen, do you want to say hello?
Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everyone's well and you can hear me clearly.
Hello, good afternoon, and the same goes for you from my side. I'm hearing you loud and clear, Kenneth, so thank you.
Excellent. So this afternoon we're going to be talking about the whole question of land. And our point of frustration for the longest time is that the way in which we've engaged with the whole question of land has been incredibly divisive. It has been a narrative that has been crafted by primarily the EFF, and now, of course, the ANC and BLF have joined that bandwagon, and they insist on talking about things like expropriation without compensation. It is our view that the best way to actually address the land question is to have people wealthy enough to be able to buy their own land. And by fixing the economy, that is the shortcut to doing that. But that doesn't mean that we've just been sitting back and working on the assumption that that's the way in which we fix the problem. So what we've done is we've taken a look at where all the available opportunities are currently, where people are either in properties that are owned by the state or have not yet been handed over to them by the state, or living on communal or traditional lands. In other words, the former Bantustans and the former homelands. And to see ways in which we can actually end up making those properties available to them so that people can become homeowners. So having done our numbers, we're very clear that we are able to very quickly fix the solution and make 20 million South Africans, of our fellow South Africans, property owners before 2020. And so today what we're going to do is to talk about how we're going to do that. So we're going to start off by talking about the land that is currently held either in the form of RDP housing or land that is currently held in state-owned housing that is rented out or is otherwise made available for low-cost housing, but land that is currently owned by the state and people don't have access to it. So the first point at which we are starting is to say that all of those properties, be they houses, be they flats, must immediately be turned over by the state under full ownership title to the people to whom those properties have been assigned. We've done an assessment in terms of how many of those properties there are, and by the simple act of turning over all of the state-owned residential land to the occupants with freehold title deeds, including all rented township land and all RDP housing that's tied up in restrictions on sale, this will create 7,058,502 homeowners or property owners. And so that's the starting point. So let's just talk about that very quickly. Now, in theory, handing over properties should be fairly straightforward. But the reason why this has been tied up is because the state has had a massive backlog in terms of how they've released these properties to owners. So there are currently 2,924,774 RDP homes where title deeds have not been handed over. And every year, the gap between the number of title deeds that needs to be handed over and the number of houses that is being produced increases. So the backlog is growing year by year as more RDP houses are built. Now, in the case of state-owned subsidized housing, there are 3,093,140 houses completed. And in addition to that, there are 1,040,588 service sites which have been completed. So adding all of these units together gives us a backlog of title deeds of 7,058,502 properties. So, and government has offered many excuses for not processing these. And they say that there are things like deceased estates, untraceable beneficiaries, or illegal occupants. We believe a simple solution is to just simply issue title deeds in the names of the original beneficiaries. So what does that mean? For example, if an RDP house was handed over to someone who subsequently died, you still hand it over in the name of that person and then let the beneficiaries of that deceased estate then fight over who actually needs access to that property. But that should not stop the scenario where we are immediately handing over ownership for all of those. So that's the first portion of the 20 million that we're talking about. So that's 7 million properties that we have in the bag. The second place that we need to look at is the former Bantustans, the former homelands, the tribal authorities, whatever you want to end up calling them. For the longest time, government and many of the other players in that space have been insistent that they are not in a position to hand over title deeds to people in those areas because those areas have never been demarcated. What do we mean by that? In most normal residential areas, or indeed all of the mainstream areas of the country, property is divided up into plots or stands or lots, or the technical term, which Roman will attest to, is urban, as in the plural of earth. And so at the point at which you buy a property or a townhouse, it is very clearly designated with the deeds office in terms of exactly what you are buying. That process has never been formally completed with regard to the homeland. Indeed, the process of actually demarcating where actual properties are has never been done either, except for the fact that government has not told us the entire story. The entire story is that government has very accurate figures, down to the exact GPS coordinates, of exactly where every home is in all of the former homelands, in all of the former Bantustans. There are 13 million of these homes, and these 13 million can immediately be handed over to the people who currently live in them. Now, government for the longest time has been insistent that tribal law or feudal law or traditional law, or whatever you want to call it, should actually determine the way in which land gets allocated in these areas. And we're saying that's fine. Go ahead and do that. Let the tribal authorities, let the king in the case of KwaZulu-Natal or in the former Transkei, have authority over the rest of the land. But there's nothing that stops us right now from anyone who happens to have a home physically located on those territories to immediately say, we want you to have these title deeds immediately, right now, because we know exactly where you are. We just need to identify who is the head of the household in that particular space, and we give you title deeds. And so we took a very specific symbolic example, which is the Nkandla local municipality. The Nkandla local municipality has 114,408 residents. And the state has already identified in the Nkandla space by itself 213 small area layers, 142 main places, 15 tribal authorities, and 27,665 dwelling frames, which we refer to as homes. So in other words, just in Nkandla by itself, we immediately have the ability to hand over ownership to 27,665 potential homeowners. And all that's actually required here is the will on the part of government to actually make it happen. So we're in agreement. There's been no demarcation of the land surrounding these homes, but we have GPS coordinates of every single home in every single traditional authority. And we are saying the time has come to hand this over to the people. So effectively, we've demonstrated that fast, efficient transfer of property rights to millions is a question of will, not a question of ability. So that is where we are at the moment. We intend tabling this as soon as we get into Parliament, and we immediately create 20 million homeowners by 2020. It is very achievable, and it will not cost us anything. Roman, Gideon, can I hand over to you?
Certainly, Catherine. Thank you so much. It is a pleasure to see a political leader who can say numbers correctly. But on to other things. This, as we stated in our media statement, all the land that does not belong to people who reside on it is what is what's called dead capital. So it's capital that is not valuable because it does not belong to the person, or it has no value because of the regulatory framework of the country. So let's say you have a household in Nkandla who have a two hectares of land. They've been living on it for a few generations. They don't have title deeds to it, and the only use is to live on it and maybe have a bit of a subsistence farming living. If you give the title deed to that land then will derive its value from that title deed. So immediately the wealth of that family or that household will increase by whatever value the land is. So someone who earns 5,000 Rand a month as a salary could now have a net asset worth perhaps 2, 3, 4, 500,000 Rand just as soon as the title deed is in their hands. And so you actually increase the wealth of a household solely by giving that household a title deed. And I think that's the fundamental question here for the Capitalist Party of South Africa, is how to make people wealthy. The easiest way to make people wealthy is to give them what actually belongs to them in this case. And in this case, it's land. So those are my original thoughts. Gideon, on to you.
Well, it ties in with the fundamental foundational stone of building a capitalist society, which is securing private property rights and expanding private property rights. Now, it might not be the strongest argument, but if you have 20 million people that are inhabiting structures that, for want of a better word, we call their home, but they're not empowered with the ownership of those structures, this sort of thing leads to a hell of a lot of negative social externalities, because if there's no ownership over these structures, there's no incentive for the person inhabiting them to add value. In fact, very often maintenance is the last thing that money gets spent on, and structures will devolve into sort of a slumified sort. And the best way of incentivizing people of looking after their property is to ensure that it's their property. And if you deny people property rights because you're not timelessly furnishing them with the documentation that makes them the owner of that property, that's in a sense expropriation without compensation, but you're doing it administratively by not issuing the ownership in the first place.
And I think it's important to clarify what's at stake here. So I know of a few people who live in Natal under the Ingonyama Trust, for example, and they lived on their land or in their property for 2-3 generations. And one had a very good idea. He had a BSc in some sort of agricultural science, and he wanted to develop this idea as a business. So he goes to the bank and said, I want to take a loan against the property that I've been living on for generations. The bank says, unfortunately, we can't give it to you because the land doesn't belong to you. You need the authority of the tribal leader before we can actually give you a loan. And then when he went to the tribal leader said no. So there is further dead capital, because this man can't create a business because he can't take credit on something that doesn't belong to him, despite the fact that it should actually belong to him. In a sense. And that's what the ZACP wants to do in terms of, by giving people property rights, the externalities of that is more production, more wealth, more jobs, more value given to everyone else.
So guys, I'd just actually like to now try and give you a sense of the kind of thing that we're talking about. And I hope everyone's able to see what I've put up on my screen right now. But essentially what we have here is an overview of the Nkandla local municipality, as in Jacob Zuma's home turf. And so this is a very specific data set which has, several gigabytes of data just covering Nkandla by itself. And if we take a look at, by zooming in on this little area that we see right in the middle, that is highlighted with that little rectangle. Now, that is a zoomed in area of Kuru, which is part of the entire Nkandla area. And we can zoom in even further, and each of those red dots that you see right now represents a home, a dwelling frame unit, as they refer to it in terms of the statistics. And all of this data has already been collated by government. So they have access to where every single person, every single homestead in every single former homeland and every single former Bantustan actually exists. And the reason why they have this is because Stats SA has actually mapped these places. And in addition to that, the census people have then needed to travel to each and every one of these homes so that they are able to confirm exactly where people are living. So what we are in fact saying is that given that government already has access to all of this data, why are they then not simply handing over the title deeds to these places? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The one is that they want to avoid a scenario where they are upsetting the traditional authorities, because I think, as we know in the case of KwaZulu-Natal as a specific example, every time you try to raise the question of land ownership, King Goodwill Zwelithini gets very upset about any suggestion that control of the land should actually be handed over to the people who are the rightful residents of that place. And right now, the king pretty much has the ability to decide at his whim, really, whether or not people get to occupy their homes. And he can actually pitch up on any given day and say, right, I can see that you've improved your home, you need to move out of here, and I'm going to be giving it to someone else. And by adopting our strategy of saying, give ownership to each of those homes to the people who actually live in it, you're actually adding to their security of tenure, because then they will be prepared to actually spend money on improving their homes because the king is not going to take it away from them. The second issue that we have to deal with in terms of government is the way government deals with the question of RDP housing. Now, government takes a nanny state approaching to the question of RDP housing. They don't want people to acquire an RDP house and then end up renting out the RDP house or selling the RDP house. Now, there are many reasons why people might want to sell. Let's say you're a person in your 40s who was allocated an RDP house 15 years ago. So you've now gotten to the stage where you're over 55, you need to retire for whatever reason, which would normally be because you've been laid off, given that RDP houses are for the low end of the market. And you suddenly now want to move back to the village of your birth and live out your days surrounded by your grandchildren. Now, you can't do that because government doesn't want you to sell your RDP house. We are saying that actually hand over all of those properties, because your being able to dispose of the property is what keeps the economy then ticking over. So yes, you might well end up selling it to someone who's from an upper income group, who will then spend money on actually improving that property and uplifting the value of all the other properties in that area as well. You might end up selling it to a foreigner, but that's fine, because you can only sell it to a legal foreigner in any case. But every obstacle that we currently have to turning South Africans into property owners comes directly from our government. It does not come from the fact that we have farm owners who are refusing to share. I mean, the amount of arable land that is under control of farms is such a minuscule fraction compared to the sheer scope of the former homelands, the sheer scope of the former Bantustans, and of course, all of the RDP housing. The figure that we've got is actually 21 million, and all of this is accurate data. Roman?
Right. And also another thing about ownership, it's about building intergenerational wealth. So as someone who does law and who helps people with deceased estates, the most difficult ones are people from tribal areas who've lived on land all their lives and their parents have just died. And then they come to me to help sort out the deceased estate, and they find out that the land doesn't actually get transferred to them at all. They are just allowed to live on it. It's not as they expected the transfer to be done in their name. So a lot of times people don't even do the deceased estates correctly, and they don't transfer the wealth. Once you give people title deeds, you'll build intergenerational heritable wealth for 20 million people. So that couldn't have happened beforehand. And that is an aspect of land ownership that is not really appreciated unless you're in the industry like I am. I see there is a question about, do tribal leaders actually own the land? They don't actually. They are what's called custodians of the land. So in the KZN, you have the Ingonyama Trust, and that trust owns the land. The king is a trustee, so is the Minister of Land Development, and a few other people, and they control the trust that owns the land. But the king himself doesn't own the land. He just has custodianship and control of it. Gideon, any comments from you?
Well, nothing really new, except that I tie in with what Canton earlier said, that any sort of assertion that people selling their RDP houses or renting them out is somehow negative is complete nonsense. You cannot add value to an asset like a property if you are unable to sell it and realize its value in a sort of free market setup later on. And liquidate it, because what's the point? If you can only transfer it back to government ownership or sell it, there's no growth in that property's value. And you're, in essence, you're handing them dead capital, but now you act like it's not dead, giving them a deed, but with conditions. So, yeah, no, it's what you want. It's yours. And we're not here to be the nannies for people making bad decisions.
Yeah, Sebastian says on the Twitter feed that Thatcher gave council houses to people, creating thousands of property owners. Exactly right. That's one of the models that we were using when we were coming up with this, where effectively she handed over the council houses. Many of those people immediately sold the council houses. But the thing is that their name then gets ticked off the list. So they don't qualify for council house going forward. And it's really up to them in terms of where they end up living in the country or indeed in the world. And you just simply move on to the next people on the list who need to be allocated housing. We're taking exactly the same approach in terms of our RDP housing out here. We are saying, as soon as you allocated a house, your name gets crossed off the list, and we move on to other people who are on the list. And government should not be in the property management business. Well, we actually take the view that government shouldn't be in the housing business to start off with. But given that they are in the housing business, let's hand those over immediately, because ultimately it belongs to the taxpayers of this country. And I think, frankly, all of us who are taxpayers would be happy to just have all of those properties handed over immediately so that we can actually get on with the business of fixing the economy. So if government actually ends up doing that, it immediately opens up the possibility for everything that Gideon and Raman have been talking about in terms of improving those properties and feeding into the economy.
Yeah, so I keep saying that people are poor because they don't have rights, and this is a classic example of that. If you look at the stats in terms of poverty, KZN and the Eastern Cape are the poorest provinces in the country, and they're also the provinces with the most tribal land. And this is the case where people do not have rights, i.e. property rights, so therefore they are poor. So it's about handing the rights back to the people that, to make them whole. And on a more philosophical and ethical moral stance, this will undo a lot of the historical disadvantages that these people were faced with by actually giving them property rights to the land they have, because most of these people were displaced through forced removals. These are former homelands. And if you give them property rights now, it won't, it's not accounting in terms of it makes people whole, but it really will assuage the sense of injustice that happened and maybe be a form of practical justice for today.
Question from Donnie Saliers. People on this list, just explain, will every single person be on a list, or is it up to my father to decide to sell and then I'm not on the list? Donnie, I'm not sure which specific question you're asking here. If you talking in terms of people who are in the former homelands, I think it'll be determined by who is the current head of the household, which more often than not is actually going to be the father in that particular case, I would think. But in order to get onto the list for RDP housing, you have to fall within a certain income bracket. Roman, help me here. Is this, I think it was 3,500 a month collected household income or less. Am I correct?
That is true. I'm not too sure whether they changed that recently, but that was the case for a number of years. But I haven't seen the latest requirements.
Yeah, so in other words, in order to qualify for an RDP house in the first place, there's a very narrow frame of reference. Again, this is totally ridiculous because, in fact, the people that you need to be allocating housing to are the people who are, in fact, already working and earning a living so that they can then have that burden eased upon them in terms of paying other people rent and then spend that money in the economy, which then translates into more money that you've got to pass down to the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. But government never really understands how these things work. Ernie Koopman says, would new owners be liable for rates and taxes that come with this ownership? I would say absolutely, but that would actually require demarcation of those properties as part of particular municipalities, which doesn't necessarily happen right now. Clearly in the case of RDP housing, rates and taxes would be set at a level that's, quite minuscule compared to what we would pay in leafy suburbs. But I think the principle of people needing to pay for services is something that needs to be entrenched across the board.
Yeah, and also on that, if you do transfer a house, you do have to pay 3 months of rates and taxes up front, generally speaking. And a lot of these RDP houses actually get free water and free electricity to a large degree as well. So that shouldn't be too much of an issue.
Question from Johan Vermeulen. In respect of Ingonyama Trust land, how will you deal with an unwilling king that won't agree to your proposals? My solution to that very simply is that you pass a law in Parliament allocating those properties to the residents and we have the GPS locations of every one of those properties. At that point, if the king tries to remove people from those particular properties, then it becomes a question of law, because you are trying to unlawfully evict a family from a property that they're currently occupying. I'm saying that once you've put that legal process in place, it creates enough of a toehold for people to then be able to climb onto bigger and better things. But it is the starting point. Just by a stroke of a pen, you put the onus on the king to show that those people have no right to the property, rather than the current scenario where the king can pretty much do as he pleases.
I just want to answer Donnie Salier's question. He says, I have a problem. I like the cow and will be voting for you, but listening to you makes me sound like what you're saying is socialist. We're actually undoing socialism, if you're really thinking about it. We're giving people property rights to land they already live on, which is essentially a form of socialism where the means of production are owned by someone else other than the person who works in the factory or lives on the land. So we're actually undoing socialism, Donnie. So I mean, I would recommend just seeing it in that way. The tribal areas are essentially socialist areas because it's owned by a central authority. By giving people property rights to their land, we are undoing socialism rather than entrenching it.
It's not just that, Ramon, if you mind me jumping in. It's also undoing feudalism to a large degree, because this is what all medieval economies looked like. The king and the barons and dukes and whatever underneath them owned the land, and you worked it as a serf, and all that you got in return is you got the protection of the king, which means that the soldiers would only occasionally rape your wife and murder your children, but they would protect you from the other bandits that roam the area, supposedly, and you're allowed to live there until you die. You're allowed to live in the little hovel that you build. Capitalism takes that same serf or peasant and says, listen, the king's gone. we have a democratic system of government, and that little piece of land that you've lived on for generations, and that little wooden hovel that you live in that's infested with lice and whatever, you now own that. You can bring improvements to it, you can sell it, you can rent it out, it becomes yours. So this is a step not just away from socialist thinking, but it's a step away from feudalism into a capitalist economy, free market economy, where people actually own their property. It might sound socialist because it's a good story to tell, but it's completely the opposite of that.
Okay, so a couple of other questions. Well, Dani Salia says, you're also taking away individual rights. No, we're not. We're actually granting individual rights. What about farm workers working farms? Will you take the farmers' property rights and give it to the workers? No, because remember, in the case of the farms, there you have established properties that are already legally held by the farmers. So you can't have a process where you are suddenly dividing up those farms. We are saying that we are looking at places that are currently held by the state or that are held communally by a tribal authority and handing those over to the individuals that occupy them, because that's the only way that we are going to unlock value in those properties.
Yes, absolutely. The DA has this thing where they want farm workers to own shares in the farm. That's a ridiculous notion. Labor is a very simple contract: time and expertise in return for wages. That doesn't give you the authority to want equity in a business. And that is not the proposal we are making at all. We are proposing giving government land to private owners, i.e. people who already live on that land.
And sorry, we're being trolled by Conscious Caracal on our timeline. Let's ignore him for now. Hopalong Lakota says, well, you let the king force KZN to secede, run his new country to the ground with traditional ideas, then reintegrate with South Africa using the proposals as conditions to rejoining South Africa. Yep, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. Dani Saliers wants to know, is the king holding the property illegally? The king is an individual, or am I missing something? This was a question that Roman addressed earlier. The king is in fact the custodian of the land in terms of the law, and at the point at which the king passes on, then whoever becomes the next king becomes the custodian of the land. In practice, of course, it means that for all intents and purposes, the king actually owns the land. But let's understand where this whole Ngonyama land trust came from, because it was part of a sweetheart deal that was entered into at the last minute in the dying days of the apartheid regime between the ANC and the National Party under de Klerk, and with the Zulu people, in order to avoid a scenario where there was massive bloodshed. And so arbitrarily, with a stroke of a pen, de Klerk signed over all of this property across to the Kingdom of KwaZulu. And people tend to kind of sweep that under the carpet right now. But yes, it was a massive amount of land that was handed over literally at the last minute before we became a free country. Let's have a quick look at what else we've got here. Julian Narayansami says, with 61 viewers, how does this message get echoed to the masses who truly care about land ownership? Raman, do you want to take that?
Well, we have no intention of reaching everyone in this country because we don't, because nothing does, in fact. Here we are just laying out what our proposal is for this in this instant, and we hope that you will take it on, if you agree with it, to share it with those who might not hear it coming from us. And that's why we do it live, and why the video will be up for eternity on the internet, so people can still go back to it whenever they hope to do so. But the media statement released this morning and the video is just for explanatory purposes.
That's correct. The media statement has already gone out to, I think, something like 2,000 odd journalists. I've had a discussion this morning already on 2 platforms, on Cliff Central early this morning, and then on Power FM at 10 o'clock. And it will continue through into the mainstream media over the next few days. The press release is available on our website on capitalist.org.za. And essentially, the point that we try to do when we table these proposals that we then intend putting forward as legislation when we get to Parliament is to get people to start thinking differently about the way in which we're doing things. So for the longest time now, we've had this lie fed to us that the way in which you go about empowering people is by taking land away from white farmers and giving them to urban dwellers who actually have no interest whatsoever in getting access to that to that land in the farm areas. People want jobs, first and foremost. We are calling the government's bluff, and we are saying, actually, if you're really serious about this land thing, here's a way in which you can do it immediately without tearing the country apart, without needing to spend any money. You just really need to get your head together in terms of the administration of handing over the title deeds. And if you guys can't do that, we'll actually get a proposal in terms of people who are able to manage the AI in conjunction with people like Google Maps, and produce a comprehensive rollout plan for how you can go area by area around the country and systematically allocate title deeds to people. So this is always what we try to do. We try to be the thin edge of the wedge that gets people to start thinking differently about how we're doing stuff. Let's see whether we've got any more questions.
I just want to answer one that asked about how do we persuade the EFF. Well, this is actually the solution to the EFF's policy on land. So the EFF's policy on land is that it was stolen and must be given back, and people must be able to use it because it's a form of wealth and it gives dignity. Whereas they believe somehow that expropriating all land in the nation will do so. We are actually saying that this is what economic freedom is: the ability to own land that has been deprived from you for arbitrary reasons and has remained deprived due to arbitrary reasons. So this is actually the solution to the proposal that they have. It's a different solution, but if it gives the same effect that they want. So I'm sure there could be some sort of mutual agreement between us about how to move forward on this idea.
And Sebastian says, yes, beating the EFF at their own game. Exactly right. It's going to be really difficult for the EFF or for government to turn around and give any reasonable explanation as to why they're not prepared to hand over these properties. We're essentially calling their bluff, and it's going to be very hard for them. Conscious Caracal points out, yes, that effectively we're relying on the butterfly effect. We start small and hope it creates a ripple that then turns into something huge. And yes, that is the entire premise around what we're trying to do. And it doesn't look like we have any further questions. So Roman and Gideon, can we have some last comments from you?
Yes. Let me just start. So the Free Market Foundation have I think it's called the Kaya Lam initiative, where they've been giving out thousands of title deeds all over the nation for about 2 decades now. And it has worked wonderfully well. This is just accelerating the process immediately, and not piecemeal by piecemeal, but in a full and extended manner within a very short period of time. If you can give people property rights within 6 months to a year from today, just by ensuring that the framework is in place to do so, there's absolutely no excuse for poverty and lack of intergenerational wealth transfer like we have today. This will really be the largest transfer or creation of wealth this country has ever known. And we really, really intend to pursue this with full force once we are in Parliament.
Just from my side, it's pretty much exactly that. Property rights are the foundation of a functioning economy, the foundation of a functioning society. It gives our fellow citizens skin in the game, many of them probably for the first time in their entire lives. And this will make them take ownership of not just the property, but also the community in which that property is situated. And this brings, of course, a whole bunch of positive social externalities with it that a lot of these communities will see for them in their existence. So we have to be all for this.
Okay, so yeah, go for it, Roman.
Sorry, Kentha. Sorry, I just want to give one last live example. I believe they're called the Shoboleni community in the Eastern Cape is now fighting with the Minister of Mining, Gwede Mantashe, because he wants to remove them from their land in order for a mining company to take over and mine that land. If they had property rights to that land, they would be the ones negotiating with the mining company, and it would be their decision. Circumstances, others can come in and exploit the minerals under their feet. Because they don't have property rights, it's a political nightmare for everyone involved. And if they had property rights, they would have a far firmer ground to stand on to negotiate royalties. A bit like the Royal Bafokeng, they've done it rather well. But in the Eastern Cape, unfortunately, without property rights, people are just used as pawns in this massive game, called politics and money.
Yeah, Roman, I think that the Western Cape data signal is starting to get really bad. So I think we're just about ready to wrap up. So for those of you who've tuned in late, just to summarize what we've been talking about over the past 40 minutes or so, essentially, we want to make 20 million South Africans property owners before 2020. And the reason why we're doing this is because land is an emotional touch point for South Africans. And although studies show consistently that this is an important issue for less than 5% of our population, political parties, the other political parties, use this issue as a destructive political rallying point, particularly EFF, BLF, and now the ANC. And we are tired of this rubbish. We know how to fix this, and we are talking about real empowerment. And like all of our policies, it's simple, it's effective, and it's cheap. And so the first place, we're demanding that government hand over all state-owned residential land to its occupants immediately in freehold title deeds. And this includes all rented township land, all RDP housing that is currently tied up in restrictions on sale. And that act by itself will create 7,058,502 homeowners or property owners. Secondly, we're demanding that all residents in dwelling units on communally held land in former homelands or Bantustans be given title to their homes, to the physical structures, not necessarily to the surrounding communally held land, but certainly if they have a house or a dwelling that is erected on that land, they need to get title deeds to that. And that will create 13,991,168 additional homeowners and property owners, which brings us a total of just over 21 million properties. Handing over the title deeds allows these homeowners to use their property as security for home improvements or starting a business, or to sell their homes and move to other areas as they become more prosperous. So with 21,049,670 recipients, it is our view this will be the biggest transfer of wealth in our country's history. And we intend tabling this as soon as we get into Parliament. So I think that's a wrap from us. Thank you so much for joining us. And please remember to tell people to come and catch this video later. Roman, Gideon, are we done?
Right. No, just saying thank you very much for joining us. I apologize for the terrible signal. The DA can't provide very good data down here. Another reason not to vote for them. But
all right.
All jokes aside, thank you for joining us. And I think this is one of the most critical issues that we want to solve, property rights and wealth creation. And this is the best way to do it. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you all for watching, and like and share and do whatever.
And we'll put up the links to the press release as well as the links to my piece about the Kaya Land project on this video as well. Thank you very much. Goodbye.